I'm not really famous at all, but if I was famous for anything, it probably is the bamboo bicycle exploit. So thank you. It's absolutely wonderful to be here. I haven't been involved with Gaia since Gaia in Oxford back in the 90s, so it's absolutely fantastic to be back again. I'm basically a very optimistic person, but there's a question that's been troubling me for decades now, and it's basically this question. Why is the allegedly most intelligent species on the planet systematically and knowingly undermining its own life support systems? Or to put it another way, what are the deep roots of the Anthropocene, the multiple interconnected challenges that we are up against right now? Now, there are lots of manifestations of the Anthropocene. I'm absolutely sure I don't need to rehearse them with this audience. This is the kind of manifestation that gets to my gut particularly. This was the WWF Living Planet report, of course, which basically told us that we have lost over 60% of our wild populations of animals in less than my lifetime. And that's only one of a slew of similar kind of reports and only one of a wider set of issues. So what's going on? I mean, this, of course, is supremely challenging to ourselves as well as to the other species that they're talking about. And in my view, both of those are equally important. So what's going on? What underlies this horrible complex of challenges that we're currently confronting? Now, there are lots and lots of candidates for deep root of the Anthropocene. Many of them would involve long discussions about our economic systems and also about power in the sense of economic and political power and the way that power is currently distributed globally. We could get into some very interesting conversations about multinational corporations, some of whom I confronted in quite extraordinary ways in my South American journey recently. But I think that is another story. What I want to focus on briefly this afternoon are some of the more philosophical roots of the Anthropocene. The idea that the worldviews dominant across Western industrialized societies, and as we've just learned from Amanda, arguably for a lot previously to that as well, those worldviews, by which I mean loosely the set of beliefs, values, and assumptions through which we interpret the world, understand it, and act on it. Some of the aspects of those worldviews are deeply, deeply flawed, particularly in terms of what they tell us about the relationship between humans and nature. Or, to put it another way, some of the roots of the Anthropocene are bad stories. Now, somebody who definitely holds this kind of bad story analysis is Robert McFarland. And McFarland, as I'm sure you know, could be called an honorary outdoor philosopher. He wrote this after he'd returned from a trip to the Arctic on a ship which was populated by a wonderful mix of scientists and artists. And they traveled to the Arctic to see for themselves what climate change was, how it was impacting on the ice. And this is what he wrote when he returned. There is no more urgent intellectual task facing the human species, no more urgent than to thoroughly reimagine its relationship with nature. Now, I used to be a relatively normal indoor philosopher. For 10 years, I worked at Lancaster University in the philosophy department, and I was privileged to be able to grapple with these kinds of questions, which I think are really, really important with my students. But I was grappling with those questions in environments pretty much like this, pretty much like where we are now. Artificial light, artificial heat, no windows, and more or less the only other than human life forms in the room are our own gut flora and fauna, and perhaps the odd flea. And also, my remit was to encourage these young people to think critically about relations between people and nature. I had no remit whatsoever to encourage them to stand up on nature's behalf. So finally, after 10 years, I did that thing where you think, oh, can I survive without an income? How am I going to pay the mortgage? Something that's catching up with me now. What about my pension? I'm not sure I even thought of that question at that point. And I left and I set up outdoor philosophy, possibly the smallest business in the world, never knowingly been made to make any money. But it's a wonderful opportunity to explore questions about the relationship between humans and nature in nature. There are many things I could tell you about outdoor philosophy, but one of my favorite versions absolutely involves sea kayaking, and my even more favorite version involves sea kayaking and environmentalists. So we used to run an annual event for environmentalists of very different kinds, ranging from a Greenpeace activist to a green consumer expert to professors in environmental politics, and pretty much everybody in between. So we had very little in common in some ways, except that we're all working on behalf of the environment, in behalf of nature conservation, and most of us ended up spending much too much time doing this work in front of computers. So in a very real sense, it was a reconnection with the stuff that we're trying to advocate and work on behalf of. And we have some very, very stellar alumni of outdoor philosophy, including our very own Professor Andy Watson, seen here, I think, celebrating his absolutely invaluable input to an attempt to reconstruct a global climate change, a carbon cycle rather, using bits of seaweed on a beach. Sadly, no photographs of that reconstruction of the carbon cycle exist. And here's Andy looking a bit more serious. I only included those photographs because I don't think we've had a caption competition yet, and this might be our opportunity. So as I say, many things I could tell you about outdoor philosophy, but I want to briefly suggest two ways in which outdoor philosophy and Gaia theory possibly converge in challenging some of the more problematic aspects of the modern industrial Western worldview, challenging some of the bad stories. And the first one, I mean, there are several, but one I want to focus on is about power. And this is power in the sense of power understood that in the relationship between people and nature, the power lies with us, that we have power and we can exercise power over nature and we can usefully bend it and manipulate it and turn it to our own ends. I don't know if any of you have seen the film that Patagonia have released recently called Artificial. It's a beautiful example of where this goes wrong. It's basically about artificial hatcheries and how when you breed trout in hatcheries and release them into wild rivers with the aim of increasing your trout numbers, what actually happens is the trout numbers crash. And they framed the whole film with this question about power and arguing that really the problem here is humans thinking they can control nature. Very, very interesting film if you get a chance to see it. And Gaia theory, of course, or at least as I understood it, I thought until some of the sessions yesterday, Gaia theory, I think, tells us that if nature is such an immensely complex system with so many interdependencies, the idea of ever fully understanding it, let alone trying to control it, actually becomes rather ludicrous. And the same thing happens in outdoor philosophy. The sea kayaking version, it's rich with opportunities to feel like a very, very small part of a very dynamic, complex, and ever-changing system. And if you get even the smallest wave or the slightest swell, then any notion that the power lies with you in that relationship just evaporates instantly. And then, of course, the challenge is to give up your idea of power and to try to figure out ways of working with the ocean, collaborating with it, working alongside it, trying how to skillfully navigate it. And of course, then the further challenge is how do we then take that back into ways we think about living and working in the so-called normal world. I think this is a really rich idea in the context of agriculture, for example. We can talk more about that later. Relinquish power, work alongside ecosystems. So the power idea would be one, I think, where outdoor philosophy, sea kayak, and Gaia come together to disperse that notion. The second is anthropocentrism. And I want to just briefly say what I mean by that. I don't mean trying to make ideas relevant to people. Obviously, that's important. And I don't mean the fact that we inevitably see the world from a human point of view. By anthropocentrism, I mean the view that of all the species on the planet, and we share it with millions and millions, of all of those species, we are the only ones that actually matter. We are the supreme locus of importance and value on the planet, and everything else is just basically a set of resources for us. Lynn Margulis clearly disagreed with that point of view. Thank you for reminding me of that fabulous quote. And again, I think this is something that clearly falls straight out of Gaia thesis. Anthropocentrism is an absurd view. We are one species amongst millions of millions, and all of us are small entities in a very, very complex and ever-moving system. And in terms of sea kayaking, it's an amazing opportunity to witness very vividly the worlds and the other species that we're lucky to coexist with. And any of you who have ever been sea kayaking will know that one of the things that often happens is you get followed by seals. and they pop up behind your boat. This is a young harbour seal or common seal. And if you have ever turned around in your boat and looked into the eyes of a seal, you will know that anthropocentrism simply dissolves. It is not a position that you can sustain in the face of that kind of look from a seal. And so I think both of these things come together in this photograph. This actually was a personal trip recently to St Kilda, where the idea of relinquishing power and being a citizen in somebody else's bigger community, letting go of anthropocentrism, come together. Robert McFarland, of course, took this idea further. When he came back from the Arctic, he wrote this. And these are three, just quickly, final thoughts I want to throw in here. McFarland talked about the idea of a community, and I think community is in some ways an even more useful metaphor when we're thinking about the ethics of our relationships with other than human life forms. Nature is neither backdrop nor storehouse, neither product nor chattel, a community of which we are inevitably part. And he, of course, owed that to the legacy of Aldo Leopold, the absolutely amazing North American hunter turned conservationist, almost the opposite of the wonderful werewolf story. I'm sure you know this story, where he, when he was still a hunter, trying to kill all the wolves so that he could hunt the deer that he wanted to hunt, he came across a dying wolf who he had just shot, and he looked into the dying wolf's eyes, and he talked about seeing the green fire going out in her eyes, and at that point he became converted and became a conservationist, and realized that trying to control the wolf numbers was completely counterproductive, and that if the wolves died, then the deer population would explode, and he needed to give up control. Anyway, so I think this metaphor of a community is super, super helpful. And then just very quickly in closing, it's also quite complex. I wish we had more time to unpack it, but thinking of yourself as a fellow citizen of a community when you're surrounded by puffins is one thing, kind of easy. When it's a basking shark, it's sort of different. Basking sharks, as you know, only eat plankton, but there's still a thing about when you see that fin going towards you, it's quite a spooky moment. And of course, when you think about yourself as a fellow citizen of plankton, that is really an interesting challenge in terms of imagination. So I think my closing thought would be, the session has been called Sensing Gaia. I think we need to sense it and also to exercise our imagination and knowledge. 1 teaspoon of seawater has about 86,000 plankton. And every time you draw a breath, about a third of the CO2 you exhale is taken up for you courtesy of plankton, and about half of the oxygen you're breathing has been produced to you thanks to plankton. So let's bring together the sensing and the imagination and the cognitive information to think of ourselves as fellow citizens of an ecological community. And then let's take that back into our ordinary lives and help with the work of restructuring the way we live and work and produce our food and our energy and our transport, etc. And in a way, of course, we have no choice but to do that. Thank you. Whew.
Thank you very much. So I think we've got time for at least one question, and we have... You got your hand up first there, Oliver. So I think you've won the battle there of the questions.
Thank you very much. Kate, you use the word we a lot, and I'm never sure. I always want to hear that word defined a bit. You seem to move between we as a community that shares these particular interests to we as all humanity. And I wondered if I could ask you, if you believe that the future is that everyone has to come to believe in a way not unlike the way that you believe, what hope is there for that actually happening?
What is sorry? What is that? Is that the question? The last bit, or is the question?
Yeah, the question is. You say we as though everyone has all the same interests, when clearly people do not perceive themselves all as feeling in the same way as maybe many of us in this room do. And it seems to me that you slide fairly easily between some we that expresses a community here and we, the human race. And I think that if your program requires the human race to all think in that way that you categorize as we, I don't think that that's a program that works. But I wanted your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very valid point, thank you. And given more time, I would have spent a lot more time unpacking who the we is, but it's tricky in 10 minutes, isn't it? I mean, there's a lot in there that actually needs unpacking. Just the whole thing about humans and nature that sets up a dichotomy and who is the we and, yeah, et cetera, et cetera. In terms of do I think we need a globalized program? Well, in a way, yes. I mean, there's a we that all of us have to learn to live on the planet in a sustainable manner. That means very different things in different places, obviously. So yeah, I think there's no short answer to the question. There would be multiple we's if we unpacked my talk and did it again. And yes, of course, there is a sense in which we all need to live sustainably, but that is also multiple we's doing that in different ways. Does that make sense?
Okay, yeah, we'll take one more.
Actually, I'd like to thank you very much for that brilliant talk, but I'd also like to come back on that question. There is a universal we, and it goes back to Lynn Margulis. We are all made of eukaryotic cells, which evolved over millions of years. And we are all made of that. We all work the same way. And so as is everything that is alive that you can see with the naked eye. And this is the we that was implicit in Kate's talk, I think. You know, when you're out in the kayak and you're surrounded by, visible things, but also invisible things like Emiliana Huxley there floating around, doing all that. And I think that is the we that we've got to grasp if we're going to address what they're calling Gaia 2 here, which I think Lynn Margulis would have called, this is just Gaia doing it brilliantly, as it has done for 3,600 million years. And I think we can get lost in all these multiple intellectual discussions about who we are. We are organisms which have evolved over 3,600 million years. And Lynn Margulis has a great phrase. She says, we are not powerful leaders or rulers of the planet. We are permutations of the wisdom of the biosphere. So, if you think of yourself as a permutation of the wisdom of the biosphere, we are all permutations of the wisdom of the biosphere. And I thought it was a brilliant talk. Thank you, Kate.
Thank you. Thank you for that comment. That's really helpful. And I think, to go back to Oliver's point, I think perhaps there's also a useful we, which is the we, probably all of us in the room who have grown up in cultures who have these problematic stories about power and anthropocentrism and who need Bruno Latour's positive, constructive invaders to come crashing in and dispel those stories for us. So perhaps that's the most dominant we in my little narrative.
Cool. Thank you very much. Nice, it's very inspiring.